we're going to take an introductory look at effective design and management of carbon markets. I've been at WRAP since about 2008 when I came here from the Vermont Public Service Board. I was a hearing officer and a staff attorney there for about 14 years. One of my jobs also was to represent Vermont energy regulators on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative staff working group, and I did that from 2003 to 2008. I'm very fortunate to be joined today by my colleague, WRAP Principal David Littell. David, whom I'm sure that many of you know, was a commissioner at the Maine PUC from 2010 to 2015. He's also served as commissioner and deputy commissioner at the Maine DEP from 2003 to 2010. He's also held various leadership positions at NARUC and with RGGI. David and I recently wrote a paper entitled Carbon Markets 101, How-To Considerations for Regulatory Practitioners. The paper distills what we think are best practices drawn from various jurisdictions, experience with carbon markets, and the paper identifies key elements of the markets and that function well. We see from the list of registrants, there are about 400 of you today, and we're really excited to see there's so many experts on this topic, and it'd be really helpful to get your insights into the sorts of next steps you might take as we go into greater depth on this subject. So please feel free to contact us after the webinar and to share your thoughts. Before we start in earnest, I'd like to make several points about the process here. We plan to take about a half hour to do our presentation, then we'll answer questions until about 5 minutes to the hour. Then David's going to wrap up things. Since there are so many of you, we prefer to hold the questions until we've completed the presentation. The exception, however, will be that if you all have burning clarifying questions, you should certainly submit them, and we will do our best to respond to them. Otherwise, if you have questions, please submit them through the question pane, and you can see on the slide up there how to do that. This presentation is going to be recorded, so we can put it on our website, and you and others can access it at a later time. And finally, we ask you to take just a minute or two at the end of the webinar to fill out a very short survey, just a couple of questions. As I mentioned, getting your thoughts will help us to be more responsive to you generally, but also will help us get a sense of the things we might delve into in greater detail at a future time. With that, David, let's get started.
Great. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Let's see, go to the carbon trading worldwide, slide number 4. The theory behind carbon trading, I think everyone knows. If you put a price on carbon, that'll send a market signal to market players, including merchant power plant developers, utility developers of energy efficiency and renewable resources, so that they have a signal that they can use in directing their capital and their investment decisions going forward. That's the general theory. The lessons we're going to talk about here today are drawn both from energy markets and carbon markets around the world. The slide up shows carbon and market-based systems adopted or under consideration worldwide, which are now in more than 50 jurisdictions in 35 countries, 13 states and provinces. If you add up the gross domestic product of each of the jurisdictions that have some type of emission trading system in place, you're at 40% of the world gross domestic product right now, and if China comes in next year as scheduled, then we'll be close to 50%. So we have a lot going on around the world, both on carbon trading, but also energy markets, and both David and I come from restructured parts of the country, so we have experience dealing with energy markets. Next slide. So EPA says that has said that compliance with the rule can produce significant long-term savings for ratepayers and consumers, and that's true. But whether it does or not is largely dependent on whether the system's set up. And when you have any sort of major transformation in the energy markets, there are distributional impacts. Importantly, the efficiency of the types of systems that are under consideration in many U.S. states now. and the economic benefits or costs are not equal across all systems. And as you look at setting up systems, hopefully based on what we're going to talk about today, you can illustrate some of the differences and considerations and develop the most economically beneficial and economically efficient system for your state. So first, the basics. One is that maintaining transparency and soliciting and making use of stakeholder input is critical at every stage of market design and implementation. Stakeholders are literally pillars of the system, or they will become, including the regulated entities, foremost among others. They will be the ones that use the system. So by being transparent and working with them and taking their advice, you build confidence and an understanding in the way the market will function. It engenders their support, and they're willing to put their investment money not just into buying allowances, but into investment that will ensure compliance with the system, low carbon or carbon-free types of investments. And that investment signal is very important to utilities and to other players. The secondary markets are the markets that develop after the initial distribution of allowances or after ERC emission reduction credits are created. And those secondary markets are not regulated by state regulators either on the air or the energy side, at least not directly. But they're important to understand because they're important for market development and for what we call liquidity. They will go into a little bit later. So again, they're not markets that air regulators or state energy regulators need to worry about, but it's important to understand the interconnection and how they help regulators do their job. And lastly, market design done well will also, as much as possible, prevent fraud and manipulation. Designing a tracking system and oversight mechanisms provide the foundation for that. And then oversight mechanisms and regular reports by oversight entities to the market facilitate open and transparent trading and create this investor and public confidence in the markets. Next slide. So this is a diagram. Staff asked us to sort of show what the multiple steps would be in creating a carbon market. So this is admittedly an oversimplified diagram. I'm going to go through it the first time, and then David, in 2 slides, David Farnsworth is going to go through it, illustrating how the elements on the right side fit into each of the steps. So the first step is to determine the scope of your system. So if you're doing the minimum clean power plan compliance, that would be your power sector, basically the electricity sector. Some states are looking at including transportation in that. Other countries have included various different industrial sectors. In fact, the majority of carbon trading around the world includes other sectors outside the power sector. And then whether the scope is going to be multi-state or regional in nature is an important question. And you'll do modeling certainly to answer that unless you're accepting one of the EPA defaults. And then you go to the second step, which is choose the type of the system. And the two are related, obviously. If you haven't done the modeling in the first step, you'll have to do it in the second step to determine what's better, to do a mass-based approach or a rate-based approach, among other considerations. And then the third step is, if you are going with a mass-based approach, is to look at how you're going to allocate and distribute your allowances. So one crucial question is whether you give them away. They did that in Europe. David Farnsworth will talk about how that didn't work out so well for them. But if you are going to freely allocate, you need to figure out the basis on which you're going to do it. Are you going to use a historically based allocation looking backwards, as EPA has in their proposed model rule? And EPA may change that going forward, but that was the proposal. Or is it going to be some type of output-based allocation or something else? That determination is completely up to the states if they decide to do a mass-based system. It's much more free-form than it would be if a state does a rate-based system. Whether the allowances would be auctioned off or sold in whole or in part, and if so, how the allowance proceeds from those sales would be dedicated. There's precedent for dedicating it to various different public benefits, such as energy efficiency, renewable programs, or customer rebates, or whether you'll have a hybrid approach between some amount of auctioning and some amount of allocations, which there is also precedent for. So that's a third step. If you're going to do a rate-based system, you also would have to look at what other activities would be eligible for creation of what EPA calls the emission rate credit, which would be energy efficiency and renewables, and what EPA proposed, but states could also propose additional activities. And then the next step, once you have those decisions made, is to really look at the type of market and the compliance mechanisms which you're going to put in place. So what we call flexibility mechanisms, which can address, among other things, volatility in the markets. These can be banking and borrowing. Banking is allowed to some extent. Borrowing is not under the Empower plan. Allowance, whether there's an allowance price, collar, and caps. If so, if you're going to put a cap on prices, you have to incorporate that into your modeling to look at what the effects would be so that you can be sure you're still going to meet your emission goals. And whether you're going to have a minimum price. Dallas Bertraw with Resources for the Future has spoke very positively of the effects of a reserve price, and it has worked out well in practice. So that's something to look at. And what types of offsets are allowed in the system. States can allow offsets within the electricity sector. They can also allow other offsets, but they can't take credit for them as a general matter if they're outside the electricity sector for purposes of compliance with the Clean Power Plan. And then, very importantly, in the fifth step here, what oversight and compliance assurance mechanisms are you going to have built into your system so that you can be sure that it's operating properly, you know, who owns the allowances, and the allowances will get to the right place. And you'll have basically control over at least the primary part of the market. And then you go ahead and you implement it. You need to have very clear start dates for market participants. You need to have very clear compliance dates. The two are not necessarily the same. You can start your distribution and auctions in advance of the actual compliance date and well in advance of when any allowances or ERCs need to be turned over for actual compliance. But you want to think through all those steps so you're sure they work. And then lastly, program review. These are systems, the energy markets are very dynamic. So you want to look at how it's working and have the ability to adjust your system to improve it basically, or ensure that it's working better. Next slide. Okay, and on transparency, as I noted previously, transparency information is very important during all phases. To ensure that there are no information disparities. Designing a regulatory system that's market-based needs to distribute all the information to all the market participants at the same time. That's critical to avoiding unfair access to important market data. So to be clear, transparency doesn't mean that you have individual staffers running out and telling individual players what you did in every meeting. That's sort of what it doesn't mean. You need to release all information to the market at the same time. So you do have to have some discipline because if it's information that could be traded on, right, you could have what's called insider trading. That's not good. So transparency doesn't mean that you sort of share information on a one-on-one basis. It does mean that you have public meetings if you can. Those are by definition sharing information with everyone at the same time. Or if you're doing modeling, that you release that information at the same time, or if you have an auction or a distribution, you release the results of that at the same time to all market players. So everyone's on an equal footing as far as trading goes. It's also particularly important during the market design and program launch stages that you be very open, because that allows the market participants literally to adjust their operations, how they're going to change their day-to-day business operations before the program goes into effect, and therefore you have a smoother transition into the program. Stakeholder input informs many of those basic compliance and market design decisions, and it's also very important if you are doing modeling to get input, to check on your assumptions to make sure they're the most valid assumptions, and on the various scenarios and sensitivities that you're looking at that you can use to eliminate both what you call your most reasonable case for what the future will look like, but also look at a bunch of different scenarios if you're wrong. So if your assumptions on fuel pricing is too low or too high, you want to have some bookends to look at what would happen if you're wrong in each direction. And you probably want to look at very different levels of investment in energy efficiency, demand response, different types of generation, different retirement scenarios, that type of thing if it's unclear what's going to happen. And again, stakeholder input can be critical to ensuring that you're making the right assumptions and looking at the right amount of scenarios for modeling. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to David Farnsworth.
Thank you, David. Next slide, please. So David and I have decided that there are a couple points here we really want to emphasize, so we're sort of double teaming on them, and transparency is one of these. You'll note in this diagram here that there's a blue triangle, and it has to do with sharing information. We think it's very important, and each and every step from initial scoping of the design of the market all the way down to the implementation, and then the periodic program reviews that follow after the program's up and running, all have this blue triangle. It's very important to share information. So while sharing information and providing that feedback, and so the regulators can get response from affected folks, is really important. It still will vary at various regulatory stages, but we just want to emphasize that information shared is very important to get out to market participants and others. It provides them equal access and essential market data, and it also helps regulators gauge the effectiveness of what they're trying to achieve in their program itself. Next slide, please. So you've got the basic balancing figure here. We've all learned that polluting for free creates an economic externality. It tilts the markets and makes them inefficient and produces all these emissions that others have to pay for in different ways. We want you to keep that in mind. Next slide. Modeling is something that's going to be central to decision-making, that supports decision-making that goes into developing carbon markets. So just let's consider modeling very briefly from a very sort of general perspective. When you're looking at a market, you're going to affect the different participants in the market, and a big part of their participation has to do with the prices that energy producers face. So energy prices associated with natural gas or coal or oil can be volatile, and it's important to understand how a model treats those assumptions. Those of you who are unfamiliar with modeling should be aware probably of the first rule of modeling. It's been said lots of ways. Modeling can be more or less useful for decision making, but it's really important to remember that all models are just that. They're models, and they characterize the future. And given all the variables that affect the energy sector, it's really difficult to predict a future of such a complex system. And it's important to remember that model predictions are likely to be off by some degree, and that future scenarios can illustrate how the future may vary if key variables change, and help you appreciate likely future scenarios, risk associated with that. So it's important, really important to remember that models will help us understand, in very broad terms, you'll help you understand the directionality of the effects of certain policies. It'll help you understand orders of magnitude. Next slide, please. It will also help you understand, modeling helps you understand risk. Our paper looks at risk. I recommend, there's a citation here, I recommend folks who want to look more into risk. A paper that was put out by Ceres, it was developed, I think it was largely written by Ron Binns, former chair of the Colorado Commission. Rich Sedano from our office also helped out with it. But it's a really valuable paper that looks at various types of risk associated with different resources, different generation types. In this matrix here, we list across the top a few risk categories, and I emphasize just a few. There are a bunch of them, and the series paper goes into more detail. And you can see them: initial cost risk, the ongoing risk associated with operating a plant, risk of new regulation, risk associated with facing the price of carbon, the risks associated with access to water. And what this is intended to do is simply illustrate some of the risks associated with different resources, which are sort of set down vertically in the left-hand side here. So if you were to compare, for example, the initial cost risk associated with energy efficiency and go down and look at pulverized coal or distributed solar, you'd be able to make those comparisons. When you look at O&M costs associated with those resources. You can see the distinctions. Again, this chart here is designed just to give you a general sense of this. I recommend going into more detail with the series paper. It will be very helpful in giving you a better sense of the many types of risk that somebody establishing a carbon market should consider as they undertake this effort. Next slide. So here's a figure that's intended to point out the importance of thinking about carbon markets as a transition. And I want to emphasize that if you're establishing a carbon market, you're playing a long game. This is a long game. This is about a transition from the oldest central station units with lots of transmission to smaller, more efficient plants that eventually might include cleaner renewable energy with other distributed resources, hydro, some natural gas, and this is going to be a transitionary period over the 21st century. When I was in high school, I remember a history teacher who really emphasized the transition that the U.S. economy had to make before it entered into World War II, and then after it got out of World War II. We were making tractors, we were making automobiles, but we weren't making tanks. We had to figure that out. We had to figure out how to make armaments, the type of armaments that would just change our economy considerably. And it was a huge effort that took a lot of time to get underway, and then the transition from swords back to plowshares, so to speak, was also a long transition for our economy. My high school history teacher said he put a picture of a aircraft carrier trying to make a turn. And folks have seen those pictures, sort of picture from a helicopter. They're taking a mile or so to turn direction because it's an aircraft carrier, like one's economy, is slow moving, and one has to be aware that the transition is slow and it's going to be very deliberate. So the changes required in this transition can be expected to be those of a similar scale. Let's look to the next slide, please. So obviously, carbon markets, we're holding them up, and many policymakers hold them up as a key tool for reshaping that energy future and transitioning one's economy. And what we're looking at here, one of the key pieces, maybe the key piece of a carbon market, is how allocations of allowances in the case of a mass-based program, or emissions reduction credits under a rate-based program, using the Clean Power Plan as an example here, how those would be conducted. So either by direct allocation or distribution some other way, use of auction proceeds, allowance value can be effectively directed to achieving public purposes, to achieving the transition that decision makers and their regulators decide are appropriate. And what decision makers can do is identify the types of resources they want to bring forward, they want to emphasize, the types of resources that they will, that they find useful for their economy, and they will be able to fund such things as energy efficiency programs or low-income efficiency weatherization programs, development of distributed resources, low-income bill assistance or bill credits. The point here is that allocation is the tool within the carbon market to direct investment, ultimate investment from others in the economy, and to articulate the direction in which one's economy is going to turn, the direction in which that aircraft carrier, so to speak, is going to move. I strongly recommend a recent paper that came out. I think the Nicholas Institute published it. It's by Brian Murray from Nicholas, Farnsworth, and Great Plains Institute. Excellent paper that looks at allocation in great detail, and I recommend that you all look at that. So it's important to also consider, in addition to allocation, how broadly you're going to go with your program. Do you just want a statewide program, or do you want a regional-wide program, or do you want nationwide or international? Big questions and lots of answers. But how broadly you go when you're considering your choice is really important. The broader you go has the potential to bring more confusion, certainly, but if you're organized enough, it has the potential to bring more diversity, and more diversity gives you more choices and potentially lower costs, which would be ideal to harness the lowest cost resources for your market. Next slide, please. So it's sort of in taking some of these steps that you look at this classic problem with externalities, and you know, as we saw from this figure, the basic response to unwanted externalities and what you're doing with a market is quite simply internalizing those costs, putting a price on those emissions, and affecting decisions within the economy to favor lower carbon intensity resources. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit more about allocation and distribution. Market designers should be aware that when you give away allowances, there's a potential for creating windfall benefit to recipients, but at the same time not making your program less expensive or least cost. There's that concern. Allowances have value, and giving those allowances to entities at no cost obviously transfers them for free. And this is true if you're giving them to utilities and restructured markets or vertically integrated markets. Probably the best example of this, it's certainly a dramatic example, is provided by the European Union's emission trading system. They've had various phases. In the first several phases, allowances were given away for free, and what happened was that recipients of allowances, obviously the European market's broader than just the electric sector, but recipients of allowances took those allowances for free and included the cost of those allowances in their bid prices for their products, and electricity was one of those. The price of steel included the cost of the opportunity cost of an allowance. Opportunity cost is the term that economists use. It's a little folky and a little corny, but I call it the Jed Clampett principle. Now, you recall the story of the Beverly Hillbillies. Jed Clampett was a poor man. He was out shooting for food, and he hits the ground, and all this oil comes out of his property. As the song goes, the next thing you know, oh, Jed's a millionaire. Well, Jed's a millionaire because despite finding the oil for free, and he could have charged people 1 penny for all that oil, he didn't. He recognized opportunity cost, and he gave the market price for his oil. So what he found for free, he charged at market price. And so when you give away allowances for free, it's not unreasonable for market players to charge the going price for those allowances. Now, one way around this is to, and one way that's been adopted in a number of jurisdictions, is to use auctions. We see this in RGGI in California, and even the EU in its third phase applies auctions in a limited manner to utility programs. So it's making utilities purchase some amount of allowances. This provides, a clear and a transparent market mechanism. It provides price discovery. What should we be paying a ton? Well, the market is selling tons for this much. So even if a small percentage of allowances is being auctioned, that gives important price information, and it helps market participants understand how to work in the market. EPA's acid rain program, which allocated allowances for free, and which does largely, even has a small percentage, I think 3% of allowances are sold, to give that price discovery effect to market participants. Next slide, please. So when we consider the two, let's call them the two flavors of clean power plan, state plan approach that have been offered by the EPA in its recent proposal, there's a mass-based approach, which is reflected in programs such as the Western Climate Initiative program that's authorized under AB 32 in California that includes the province of Quebec, the RGGI program, the EU ETS. There's this mass-based approach where compliance is demonstrated by simply showing how many tons you've emitted at the end of the year and having allowances in proportion to those tons to demonstrate compliance with the program. There's that mass-based approach, and then there's a rate-based approach. And a rate-based approach, as the term suggests, simply requires that jurisdictional emitters meet a certain rate of emissions per some unit. In this case, it's per megawatt hour. So you have to be carbon intensive up to a certain point per megawatt hour under either of these programs. Both types of programs allow for exchange of instruments. So they allow for a market-based approach to compliance. And they're both designed, anyway, to be readily tradable. I'm not going to go into huge detail about either of these, but under a mass-based program, what it allows you to do is the program can auction allowances and use auction revenues and dedicate those to a certain purpose. By capping emissions, just the same as requiring a certain emissions rate, what you're doing is drawing a line in the sand, so to speak, and certain emitters are going to appear more favorably in a market, the lower carbon intensity emitters or the no carbon emitters, in relationship to others who are emitting more carbon. Allowances are used under the mass-based program, and emission reduction credits, or ERCs, are used under the rate-based program. Let me give you an example. Next slide, please. Let's just simply illustrate with wind, for example. But this illustration could be used with natural gas, new efficient natural gas, combined cycle gas, or energy efficiency, or any of those resources when you go back to the slide that looked at risk. So we can illustrate briefly how resources would be affected by either of these clean power approaches. With a mass-based program, as I mentioned, it supports renewable energy indirectly by increasing the value of carbon-free energy, and by comparison, the benefit associated with well, increasing the value of carbon-free energy vis-a-vis carbon-intensive energy. Mass-based programs also can be used to directly support through allocations of some means, or through sale of allowances and then allocation of directly of revenues from allowance sales and auction proceeds to certain types of resources. By contrast, under the rate-based approach, rate-based systems use resources that operate below that required emissions rate that I mentioned, and those units, such as wind, can generate ERCs and receive money by selling ERCs, because the hallmark of the rate-based approach is that jurisdictional emitters are able to not only become more efficient as generators themselves, but also they can benefit their rate by purchasing ERCs and including those in the calculation of their bottom line rate. So a rate-based systems is advantageous from a cost viewpoint if for example, compliance with a rate-based requirements already predicted by modeling under the business as usual energy sector developments through 2030 under this program. Otherwise, well, your modeling is going to show whether or not going rate-based or mass-based is in fact beneficial to you. And with that, I think I'm handing off back to David.
Thanks, David. Okay. We'll touch on a number of elements for a well-designed market system. Next slide, Jake. The secondary markets, we talked about that earlier. Now, why would a state official care about the secondary markets if you don't regulate them? And the answer to that is what economists call liquidity. What liquidity means in simple terms are that sellers can find buyers and buyers can find sellers. And it sounds simple, but it hasn't always been the case for every market. So, for instance, under some of the earlier NOx markets, I know when I was environmental commissioner in Maine, we had a facility that we wanted to develop because even the governor and others liked jobs, particularly in the more rural parts of the state. And one of the problems that they had was that they couldn't find the NOx offset credits. So liquidity can be a problem if the system is designed the right way. And in simple terms, you want it. You also want it because, and I'll go into this in more detail when I get to ownership of the allowances or the ERCs, but liquidity can also open up the door to market manipulation if you have very illiquid systems. So next slide. In terms of achieving least cost compliance, you want to look at this if you're not taking the EPA defaults, but if you're doing modeling, which most systems will do, and look at what the effects are, multi-state or regional compliance. Usually, the economic theory is you'll have more opportunities if you expand your ways to reduce carbon or achieve low carbon electricity to broader areas and markets across multiple states. So some states will have lower cost generators. Some states will have more opportunities for energy efficiency or other demand side resources, and some states will have complementary programs that are already in place. So you'll have different resource mix. And as you expand your area, you'll have more opportunities to move from high cost compliance to low cost compliance, and you'll also diversify your risk. So if you're a small state, and we certainly saw this within RGGI, where we had unanticipated emission growth in certain states, and if those states stood on their own, both the cost of energy and the cost of carbon allowance would have gone up substantially, but because they were part of an integrated system, it didn't happen. The markets just naturally adjusted for that, and we ended up with a pretty strong trajectory. So it shows both volatility, which is unexpected rises or falls, and risk is also addressed by broader markets. Now, if you're not, David Farnsworth spoke about auctions, so I'm not going to talk about that, but if your state doesn't have the option for auctions, there's another option which a lot of public utility commissions often use with resources and the utility area, and that would be either for the environmental agency or an energy agency or the PUC to give or dedicate the allowances to your local distribution companies for electricity and require, and I have that underlined here because you need to require them so they don't act as free allowance giveaways that David talked about, to sell them and use the proceeds for ratepayer benefit. If you do that, that has been done in another area, and most utility commissions have plenary authority to do things like that, so it's another option. And if you're still in states that do integrated resource planning that are vertically integrated, you can look at all of the resources, demand side and supply side resources for energy across the board to look at the most cost-effective ways to do it. Again, that's planning, usually based on modeling, and modeling is only as good as your various scenarios and your assumptions are that go into it. But those states that are still vertically integrated do have one advantage. They can look at all the resources and take those into account in ways that are much harder to do in the structured state. Next slide. This next slide shows what are commonly known in the energy area as Lazard levelized costs for various energy resources. Very well known. These are the updated 2015 figures. So you can see overall on a U.S. national basis, the most cost-effective resource continues to be energy efficiency by quite a span. And then followed by wind and grid-scale solar, and then combined cycle natural gas. Now these are overall, these don't take into account regional variations, but these are the types of costs you look at. And you want to do it, again, looking at various different scenarios, because the one thing you know is these are going to change. Costs are very dynamic in the energy area, and whatever you plan, unanticipated things will happen, like the price of natural gas will go up, as we saw in the middle of the last decade, and then now it's down again. The cost of from a regulatory point of view, one approach that we would recommend is to design a system so that you incorporate regulatory flexibility to allow the regulating community to adjust to changes in the energy markets, so that you have a variety of mechanisms that they can use to adjust and shift for whatever happens in the energy market, so you don't need to change your entire regulatory approach based on what you model. You'll thereby reduce both costs and risks over the long run. And a well-regulated carbon market will be one that provides the mechanisms to ensure compliance coupled with sufficient flexibility to allow compliance under a broad range of future conditions. Next slide. In terms of moving forward, one thing that we at RAP recommend is trying to combine traditional integrated resource planning, which is a Public Utility Commission energy sector least cost planning model that looks at different mixes of energy resources, generation, sometimes efficiency and renewables, to come up with the best least cost mix that your utilities can use to go forward and plan. That's really an economic exercise. And to integrate it with environmental planning to look at various different environmental requirements that are coming here or on the horizon, which is a very different type of undertaking. Next slide. So what this would look like is you take the traditional strengths of IRPs run by PUCs and state implementation planning run by environmental agencies, and you combine them into a forward-looking integration of both of these, and you would incorporate all of the various different environmental requirements, from the cross-state rules to the mercury and air toxic rules, no ozone standards, regional haze, SO2 and NOx requirements, and look at what the different costs are across various different energy resource mixes to see what both your cost implications are and your risk implications are. So whereas it might look like a least cost option to switch from a coal unit to a natural gas unit, if you look at the NOx requirements and the fact that you might have stricter ozone requirements in the future, that may end up being a riskier proposition than you thought if you're in a non-attainment extent. Next slide. Back to program elements. Who can own allowances or ERCs? Maybe you wouldn't think this would be an issue at first, but likely when you're going through a stakeholder process, you'll get some comments that will suggest that ownership should be limited to certain types of compliance entities. We did when we set up RGGI, and that can become a liquidity concern. It's the issue that we call it to your attention, particularly if you're in a state or region where you have generation owned by a small number or a large number of utilities. Because if they're the only ones who can own the allowances, you could end up in a situation where you either have a buyer who can decide what they can release to the market on their own terms, or they can control or restrict the supply, and that can create real buyer and supply side market power issues, to use an economist's terms. So it's an important consideration that's put forward. It's often put forward as a way to create stability in the market, but in fact it is likely to have exactly the opposite impact. So it's a very important design consideration, and the economists who we consulted with uniformly suggested that was not a wise idea. You also want to know, for purposes of setting up your primary market, your distribution system, whether it's auction or otherwise, you want to know who you're dealing with. So you need affiliate disclosures to know what entities are related to who. And you may also, particularly if you do an auction, want to set up financial security requirements. That's very standard in the energy area, to have very strong financial security, because if someone wins an auction, you want to make sure they can pay for what they've said.
David, could you speak up just a little bit, please?
Sure.
Helpful, thank you.
And so, next slide. You also, next slide, check in. Can you hear me, Jake? Next slide. On minimizing market, thank you. You want to look at setting up a clear and transparent market to avoid market manipulation too, because if different entities can see what's going on in the market and entities know that you can see what's going on, they're less likely to engage in inappropriate behavior. And that principle comes over to the oversight system. You want to set up a strong registry and tracking system, either using what EPA is going to develop, which we don't know yet, so we can't comment too much on that. We got a couple requests to comment on it, but we don't know. But you certainly want it to be a strong system because you want to know who's trading and who's selling. You also want to have oversight of the secondary market, and that's, again, where secondary markets can come in very handy for monitoring your primary market. Because if you do an auction and your pricing isn't pretty similar to what's in the secondary market, that shows you something isn't operating the correct way. So you can look at the secondary markets as a check on whether your primary markets are working the same way and whether the relationship is what a financial person would expect. You can also have participation requirements, particularly in your primary distribution mechanism for allowances or ERCs. So you may want to have minimum purchase requirements. You may want to have maximum purchase requirements. So, for instance, no one can purchase more than a quarter of the allowances in any one individual auction. Already talked about affiliate disclosure and financial security. So, next slide. And in general, maximizing the allowances that are available for purchase or sale will add to liquidity, so that will also minimize the ability of individual players to control a larger portion of the market. That might be ideal. And adopting a market monitor system is highly advisable. That's something that the RGGI states adopted from the energy markets. Market monitors are very well known in the energy markets because they're monopoly markets, so they're not truly competitive markets. You use market monitors to determine whether you're trading in ways that are consistent with what you see in a competitive market. So the market monitors will review the results of each auction. They do that before the auctions are certified and approved by the state officials. They also, on a quarterly basis, look at the functioning of the secondary markets and compare those to what's going on in the primary markets. And then on an annual basis, they also report on how the markets are functioning. So all of those reports can work very well and also encourage confidence in the markets. And lastly, even though state regulators don't primarily regulate the secondary market, they can exchange information on what they see going on and what federal regulators who do regulate in those markets, such as the Commodities Future Trading Commission, do see. That informal information exchange can work fairly well. So with that, I know we have a number of questions. I'm prepared to answer some, but I'll turn it back to David Farnsworth.
Great, thank you, David. I appreciate that. Great job. First, we got a question. We got a question about the paper that I mentioned from Franz Litz and Brian Murray. The paper is entitled "Mass-Based Trading Under the Clean Power Plan: Options for Allowance Allocation." And you can find it at the Nicholas Institute website. So the authors are Brian Murray and Franz Litz, L-I-T-Z. David, what happens to the allowances under a mass-based approach for units that are that retire during the compliance period? And how long can these allowances be banked?
Under the Clean Power Plan defaults, I mean, part of the answer to that question would be what they want to do when they set up their system. So you asked, there were two questions. Can you divide it and ask the first question? I'll try to answer it based on what EPA has proposed to date. I assume that's the way it's being asked.
Yeah. For non-RTO participants, who will be the market regulator?
Okay, hang on. I'll answer that question, David, but then want to go back to the prior question to make sure we answer it. For non-RTO, who will be the primary regulator? The primary regulator could be the state commission, the non-RTO area. That would be one wise way to do it. They would, if it's a non-RTO area with a lot of rural cooperatives or others, they want to do that in concert with their rural cooperatives. But there's no reason why a market-based system could work very well even for a mixture of rural cooperatives in an area or part of the country that doesn't typically use those approaches. So that's one answer. I think in the first instance, it's primarily going to be up to the state officials how they want to set up that system, and if they want to use a market-based system, those commissions could set it up that way, and you know, we could usually, since RAP advises state officials, we could help them set that up if it's not clear to them how they might approach that.
Thank you.
Go back to the other question, David.
Yeah, I
want to make sure we handled it.
Yeah, what happens to allowances under a mass-based approach for units that retire during the compliance period?
And so that question seems to assume that if that was an issue under EPA's proposed allocation, and which was only proposed and which EPA is going to finalize in their model rule. But since EPA had proposed a historic allocation, there was a question on how long those allowances would go to those units, and EPA allowed a time period for them to go even to the units after they closed down. That was one of the, there was a lot of comments and issues that I know came into that. So, my answer to the first part of that question would be to wait and see what's in the final rule before we get too much into that, whether EPA sticks with their historic allocation or whether they stick with, I believe it was 3 years, that even a closed down unit would be allowed to receive its allowances even if it retired. But I would have to check on whether 3 years was right or not.
Thank you. This question has to do with a different sort of proposal. What do you think about the Citizens Climate Lobby proposal of a revenue-neutral carbon fee and dividend, CO2 tax?
A CO2 tax. We got a couple of questions on that earlier as well. And so in terms of a CO2 tax, it is another compliance option. It's different than rate-based or mass-based, obviously. It has worked very well in British Columbia, where they include motor fuels, so traditional petroleum fuels, which is a scoping issue that you'd want to obviously make up front. And it has resulted in some significant reductions in those. So it is an alternative approach. You'd have to look at the regressive effects because there are some significant regressive effects to a tax approach. So British Columbia is an area where it's worked well. There are other reasons why it may not work so well. And so particularly this question was on the citizens. Can you state it again, a particular proposal that's out there?
The Citizens Climate Lobby proposal of revenue-neutral carbon fee and dividend CO2 tax in parentheses.
Yeah, and it's certainly an approach that's worth looking at and considering. One caveat is that it would work better if it's done by multiple states that are close to one another, to the extent you're looking to affect investment decisions and ordinary citizen action. If you were to put a tax, we certainly see it in New England where we have smaller states. If you have taxes that are differential in one state or the other, you'll have border issues with citizens driving across the border to purchase their gas where it's a little bit cheaper, that type of thing. Especially ordinary citizens aren't always, economically rational. They might spend more driving across the border to try to save money when in reality they're spending money. So you need to take that type of thing into account.
Thanks. That's great. I would add a couple observations. First, that electricity the electric sector has very low elasticities of demand. So electric prices can go up, and it's hard to find alternatives, and it's hard for customers themselves to find alternatives. So whether you're using a tax or whether you're using a cap-and-trade mechanism, putting a price on carbon-intensive resources may mean you have to put quite a price on them to simply change behavior. One of the things that we've learned over the last decade since people started thinking about applying cap-and-trade to carbon, this is in the context of Waxman, Markey, McCain, Lieberman, is that there a certain amount of understanding about what are called complementary policies 10 years ago, 6 or 8 years ago, complementary policies, and today what are being called beyond the fence solutions are that those may end up being the lowest cost ways to avoid CO2. So if a carbon tax, such as the Citizens Climate Lobby proposal, comes with a mechanism that would direct decision makers to make investments in the least cost resources, then society could get carbon reduction for the lowest cost possible. I understand that Cantwell-Collins legislation was a cap and dividend approach that sounds similar to this proposal, and certainly popular sense that money's going to get sent back to would-be ratepayers, and that makes sense. You don't want to burden them unnecessarily. But a cap-and-trade mechanism or a tax, if it doesn't have that secondary approach and that link to investment, that's going to be a catch in my view. David, another question. Does the option of distributing allowances to load-serving entities, in parentheses, with requirements for the proceeds to benefit ratepayers, end parens, need legislation in most states?
To get them directly to ratepayers, it would depend the way that you do it. If you do it through, I think the question used the word proceeds, which suggests you're doing an auction. So if you're doing an auction, I think the answer is yes, if it's a state entity doing the auction, because usually when money comes into a state, some form of appropriation. If you do it through your utilities, it's very common, on the other hand, for public utility commissions to tell utilities how to dispose of particular assets. And in this case, if a state decided to approach it by having a utility either conduct an auction or sell them into a pre-existing market, a state commission likely could, without looking at the particular legislation in that state, likely could direct the utilities use those proceeds as a rebate or for some other purpose that's related to utility functions, such as for energy efficiency or renewables. It's likely you could do that without legislation in a lot of states.
Great. So we're approaching the top of the hour. Just a quick, I'm going to give you a really difficult, involved question that requires a really quick answer, David. Can you speak to the potential limits of LSE public benefit uses? In particular, is there any difference from restrictions that may have been imposed from funds raised from customers as opposed to those raised from carbon auctions?
The question to particular restrictions on particular uses is going to be a state law specific issue. Generically, there's no reason why those have to be restricted, but some state legislatures have chosen to restrict particular uses to particular fund-raising sources in very specific ways. So you'd have to look at the authorization in each state and see if there are any restrictions. It's a quick answer.
Great, thank you. Well, so folks, we've reached the top of the hour. I want to thank David for this terrific presentation. The responses. Our thanks to you all for joining. We want you to watch your email because we're going to be sending you links to the recording of the webinar along with a slide deck. And so we've just come up to the initial, the end of our initial presentation. David's going to recap this very quickly for us, and then, as I mentioned, we'll continue on answering your questions after the top of the hour. David?
Yeah, so in setting up a carbon market, it's very important to go through stakeholder processes and have a transparent process from beginning to end. That engenders confidence in the market rules, also that the enforcement mechanisms and the appropriate oversight will be happening, because without that transparency, it's very difficult to conduct effective oversight. That follows through during design to the assumptions and the way that you do modeling. And of course, it's important to look at minimizing fraud. One question we got, for instance, in going into this webinar from one of the participants is, how do you set up your prices to take other regulatory programs such as RPSs or energy efficiency into account? And if you're going to do that, the simple answer is you need to do the modeling to see how much the price of carbon is going to interact with load reductions from energy efficiency and carbon-free resources that will be brought into another mechanism that will be financed through a renewable portfolio standard. That is exactly why people do modeling, is to figure out the interactions between all of those factors and look at your variation in price, and then you do different sensitivities to look at how you'll vary your results based on what your RPS level might be, what your energy efficiency funding might be, and what your range of carbon prices are, what your range of natural gas and coal prices are, etc. So quick answer, David, I think we're going to stay on if people want to continue to ask questions for a little while.
Yes, we are, David. Thank you again. So that ends the official portion of this webinar, folks. David, thank you again for the great presentation. What we're going to do now is shift back to answering questions. Are you ready, David?
Yep.
Okay. Slide 16 compares mass-based and rate-based programs. Under mass-based program, there's a point that states mass-based programs have a 40% lower cost than rate-based. Maybe we can turn back to that slide while I'm reading this. Thank you. Then rate-based. For clarification, what are the sources and/or what are the modeling work does this figure come from? If a state is in the process of determining whether to choose a mass or a rate-based plan, what are some of the key technical resources they should review?
Do you want to?
I'm going to let you take
David,
it.
I know. Okay. If a state is looking at that, your technical resources that you want to look at are, everything from EIA projections, which are very important, to the modeling that I think that we talked about, to existing. You want to take advantage of a lot of the resources that are out there for people and entities that have experience with it. I wouldn't spend too much time with EPA background documents unless you're thinking of just taking one of the EPA opt-in options. If you're thinking of opting into what EPA specifies, understanding that basis is important. But if you're looking at setting up your own system, that generally most state officials are going to find works better for them because they can sculpt their system based on the particularities of their economy, their electricity sector, for what works for their stakeholders. Really developing your own set of assumptions, your own modeling, and working with stakeholders to hear what they want, and asking them that question is going to be the right starting point.
Thanks, David. If a state only auctions off a small portion of allowances, for example, 10%, and distributes the remainder for free, how representative of the cost of reducing carbon is the auctioned price likely to be?
Well, the auction's price will be good. It will provide good cost, what's called good price discovery, rather. And price discovery means that you get a price that's representative of the actual market conditions. The way the question was asked, it asked the price of reducing carbon, and whether the price that you get from price discovery is representative of the price of reducing carbon is a different question. That'll depend on how well you set up your markets to actually be representative of that price, because the markets may approximate that price, or they may not, depending on how well all of the different pieces work together. So if you have, for instance, a very high RPS or a lot of power purchase agreements for renewables, that may drive more of the carbon reductions than the actual price of carbon. So you have to know what other pieces you're working with to see how they're working together. In other words, there's an inverse relationship, right? It's the same. It's true in the energy market. If you pay for one resource to another funding mechanism to come on, and you have a price of energy or a price of carbon, that direct price is going to go down if you're using another funding mechanism to actually support development of the new energy resource that happens to do lower carbon. So you have to look at how all the pieces are working together.
That's a great response. I would add that, and just suggest folks keep in mind the slide that David put up on integrated planning. When states look at different resources available and the experience that they have with their programs, their clean energy programs, that their neighbors have with programs that the state may not have, but their neighbors have, they will also gain a sense of what it costs to avoid a ton of carbon. And I think it's important to emphasize, if they're looking at a number of other pollutants at the same time, they may find that the combined cost of reducing those pollutants is much lower. And so not only will carbon factor into that, but maybe the other pollutants as well, and the sort of sweet spot that some compliance approaches may have that get after more than just one resource. So that was a terrific question. For carbon markets that include other sectors, is there a problem that some sectors have a low elasticity of demand? For example, light-duty vehicles and gasoline, they can easily absorb modest carbon taxes?
That's not the only consideration, but that's a very good question and a consideration. It's not just the elasticity of demand that you want to consider, but also the cost of abatement and the benefits, the amount of carbon impact, and you might want to look at the impact on other pollutants and other factors as well, environmental and otherwise. So if, for instance, if you're including the transportation sector or motor fuels, the question was absolutely right on. You probably do have a higher elasticity there, which is probably why British Columbia is seeing such significant reductions from their carbon tax. And an economist would say, well, that's economically efficient. And it is efficient if you have at least equal or greater damage or impacts coming from that sector, which I think we know for carbon and other pollutants you would. So that's a good outcome. But if you're looking at other sectors, particularly commodity production for manufacturing that's in trade-exposed areas, you'd want to look both at your impact of the fuel prices for their overall activity and probably do some macroeconomic modeling on the impacts and really understand that sector for how exposed they are and whether what you're doing is going to be a significant issue for them in terms of their operations and their ability, because you obviously don't want to do something to an important part of your economy without understanding the implications.
Okay, David, I'm going to share the following observation with you, and I'd like to get your take. Doesn't experience suggest that a critical initial step is deciding what the market is supposed to accomplish? No one ever does, but then you have the goal of minimizing compliance costs and providing a price signal to list two, totally contradicting each other.
That's a good question. To the extent there's a suggestion that you ought to know what you're doing when you set up a market, and what you're doing means what purposes you're setting it up for, that is absolutely correct. Markets are set up for particular purposes, whether it's a stock market. The purpose of a stock market is to allow for equity investments in private companies, or a bond market, which is to allow for non-equity bond-type investment. Those markets have particular purposes. They're man-made. And a carbon market is the same, which is the reason why we pointed out you might want to think about more than carbon, because carbon is it's the obvious thing that we're talking about now, but the price of some of the other pollutants is actually greater, both on the abatement side and on the human health impact side and the environmental side, for many parts of the country. So SO2, there are SO2 markets that are functioning in many parts of the U.S. But thinking about the two together makes a lot of sense, because doing individual market regulation may make sense at the end of the day. You may decide to keep the markets separate, or you may want to take more of an integrated approach, but it's a question worth asking. And another area that's also costing a lot of sort of utility attention right now is compliance with the visibility requirements in regional haze and particulates. Particulates, in particular PM2.5, the smaller form of particulates, have huge human health impacts. So looking at all these things together makes a lot of sense, and that goes to the purpose, which the question suggested. You want to ask what your purpose is, and you want to say, is keeping the purpose limited? Does that make sense? Does making it broader make sense, or do you want to consider that question and look at your options? Because if you end up with a good solution for carbon that doesn't work for regional haze, well, you're going to have a problem with regional haze. And regional haze is an exercise that's supposed to be done under the Clean Air Act every 10 years. EPA just proposed a 2-year extension, but it is coming up again. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, David. I would just pile on a little bit, just to provide an example that you alluded to when you talked about regional haze coming up. When you think about carbon emissions reductions, you might say, look, let's avoid coal and use natural gas. After all, natural gas is about half the emissions. And that sounds pretty good. That's 50% reduction. But when you consider ozone standards and having to comply with ozone standards, natural gas has a lot of NOx emissions, which of course combined with weather activity in the atmosphere result in ground level ozone. So gas may not be the best solution, may be a pretty nice solution for carbon, but not be the best solution when you consider other resources. When you consider efficiency, take another example. It doesn't have the NOx, it doesn't have the carbon, nor does it have the SO2 or the mercury or the particulates. And so while the question there, sort of implicit in the question is, why don't you figure out carbon and don't get confused by too many other things? The fact of the matter is that certain compliance resources for carbon are actually really good at capturing other benefits. And when you put those all together, the bang for the buck is enormous. And when it comes right down to it, the economy is going to benefit, and everybody will benefit if you get at the cheapest resources first, the cheapest compliance solutions first. So in other words, if you can get after a ton of carbon for $2, let's not look at the $3 tons of carbon yet. Let's get all the $2 tons of carbon. That's the idea. Another question, David. Doesn't experience, oh, no, I've just done that, I beg your pardon. The EPA has been criticized for leakage protections it has proposed for the Clean Power Plan. What are the best practices for protecting from leakage when the carbon or other pollutant market only covers a subset of polluters? I should have just provided a little background here. Most folks know, but the leakage solutions under the Clean Power Plan are for states to demonstrate that their Clean Power Plan is, once implemented, is not going to result in less use of the affected units under the Clean Power and more use of new units that are in the state. And that can be simply done by a demonstration of some sort. States could also include new units under the Clean Power Plan, which is designed to look at existing units. Those are two of the solutions. But the question here is, what are the best practices?
So the observation that EPA has been, a number of parties have been critical of those leakage provisions, meaning in this context, leakage from existing units to newer units, primarily natural gas, is right. I don't think there's a lot of folks who think that EPA got that right. And EPA is working with this construct of new sources and existing sources from the Clean Air Act, which is awkward in this instance. But what the best practice probably would be to include both existing and new sources in a state compliance plan. In the short run, some states may not want to do that because they would think they'd have more flexibility for newer units than older units. But in the long run, it's just not going to make sense to have what are existing units at the beginning of January in 2014 regulated under a different scheme than units that were built after that date in 2014 and after. And as we go on with time and get towards 2030, it's going to be very difficult, in my view, to have two different regulatory schemes. So the best practice would be to develop a system that regulates both types of units similarly, whether it's mass-based or rate-based, and then move forward from there. You'll have equity between units and a level playing field between existing and new units.
Thanks, David.
David, do you want to go ahead?
No, I have nothing to add to that. I have an additional question. I'll make an observation and then pass it off to you. Quite a long question, so I hope we can keep this in mind. I see how in restructured markets, free allocation to merchant generators could result in windfall profits because they will reflect the opportunity cost of allowances in their bids. I don't see how this dynamic applies to fully regulated states where virtually all of the Clean Power Plan affected units are operated by vertically integrated utilities, in other words, where there are no merchant generators. In such states, the PUC or other economic regulator can ensure that the value of freely allocated allowances is used for the benefit of customers and prevent windfall profits. Could you explain how this situation could occur in a regulated state with vertically integrated utilities? I think that the questioner actually, from my perspective, answered the question and put a finer point on it, and I should have added that. And that point is that when these allowances are allocated for free, if the utility commission doesn't recognize these assets and doesn't make sure that they're used in the public interest, in the best interest of ratepayers, then the windfall problem could occur. At the very least, this free allocation of allowances could occur without ensuring that related investments to reduce CO2 occur, without the regulator stepping in. So I think I agree with that observation, and to me that would be this distinction between restructured markets where you have merchant generators and otherwise where you have vertically integrated utilities that have regulatory oversight. Something to add to that, David?
Yeah, I would add to it. So I think, David, you made it clear in a restructured environment, it's more of a concern, and I think that's right. But even in a non-restructured environment, the PUCs have to issue an order, and the order needs to start out with an accounting of how the allowances or ERCs that are generated by utility assets, if the utilities are allowed to operate renewables in that state, how they're going to be treated, because it's not, as a matter of utility law, if the PUCs don't tell the utilities how they have to account for those, the utilities can bank them on the shareholder side and walk away with the proceeds, and that's what you would expect the utility executives to do. That's maximizing the value for their shareholders. That's their job. So you can't assume, it's inaccurate to assume that if they get these assets, they're going to use them for ratepayer benefits. The utilities are required to do the best they can for their shareholders, so if they're not ordered by the PUCs to account for the value up front and then to ensure that that value goes to ratepayers, that's not going to happen.
Okay. I think we have one final question. This is a very strategic and insightful question, I may add. If a city has a wastewater system with a long-term capital improvement program to modernize infrastructure, $700 million to $900 million, for example, which will result in very substantial reductions in demand and energy consumption, in other words, between 30% and 50% reductions, can the structure of a state implementation plan for the Clean Power Plan / market design affect the value of the allowances and ERCs to which the city may be entitled?
So that's the city's own plan that would reduce its own load. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the state plan would very much affect whether the city gets credit for those at all or not. Would be the quick answer. The compliance approaches adopted by the state will affect the answer to that question entirely.
So in the case of a rate-based program, the utility company providing support for this investment, or the publicly owned treatment works itself making these investments and avoiding these energy costs, would be in a position to apply for emission reduction credits, correct?
If it's a rate-based system, yes. You asked for, I heard two different questions. If the utility is supporting it, that suggests other ratepayer money may be going into it. So you want to make sure you're looking at the various different sources of funding and make sure you use that funding most effectively and most efficiently. It may make sense to use it on the front end and not worry so much about the IRCs on the back end, or the opposite. So we need to be more familiar with the individual circumstance. If the funding isn't utility supported but is coming purely from city resources or local resources, then you have a different situation and it's not being supported by any other state programs. Then you really have a potential benefit of reductions that are funded by city taxpayers or ratepayers if it's a water utility. But the state itself would benefit from that, and other reductions that would have to be made would be less. And that, again, depends entirely on the structure the state adopts. If it's a maps-based system, there may be no way for the city to recover its funds, but I wouldn't assume it just because it's rate-based there'll be a big market for that either. You have to look at the state situation, because most states I'm aware of that are looking at going rate-based probably are not going to have a great demand for IRCs, so the value of IRCs may not be very much.
Okay, great answer. David, I think we've come to the end of it. Everybody, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thanks, David Littell, for this. And as I mentioned, folks, be looking for a recording that's going to come your way, a link to a recording of this webinar, a copy of the slide deck. And when you sign off, please take the time and answer those few questions that we ask. Again, thanks so much. I hope you all have a great day.